A Mystery by Arthur Machen. Chapter I. The Coming of the Terror. After 2 years we are turning once more to the morning's news with a sense of appetite and glad expectation. There were thrills at the beginning of the war, the thrill of horror and of a doom that seemed at once incredible and certain. This was when Namur fell and the German host swelled like a flood over the French fields, and drew very near to the walls of Paris. Then we felt the thrill of exultation when the good news came that the awful tide had been turned back, that Paris were safe, for a while at all events. Then for days we hoped for more news as good as this or better. Has von Kluck been surrounded? Not today, but perhaps he will be surrounded tomorrow. But the days became weeks, months. The battle in the west seemed frozen. Now and again things were done that seemed hopeful, with tones of S. But Neuve-Chapelle and News dwindled into disappointments as their goal fully. The lines in the west remained, for all practical purposes, nothing seemed to happen, save the record of operations that worked in triangle. People speculated as to this action. The hopeful said that Joffre had a plan, that he was niddly. Others declared that we were short of munitions, others again that the new levies were not yet ripe for battle. So the months went by, and almost 2 years of war had been completed before the motionless English line began to stir and quiver as if it awoke from a long sleep, and began to roll onward, overwhelming the enemy. The secret of the long inaction of the British armies has been well kept. On the one hand it was rigorously protected by the censorship, which severe, and sometimes severe to the point of absurdity, the captains and the depart, for instance, became in this particular matter ferocious. As soon as the real significance of that which was happening, or beginning to happen, was perceived by the authorities, an underlined circular was issued to the newspaper proprietors of Great Britain and Ireland. It warned each proprietor that he might impart the contents of this circular to one other person only, such person being the responsible editor of his paper, who was to keep the communication secret under the severest penalties. The circular forbade any mention of certain events that had taken place, that might take place, it forbade any kind of allusion to these events or any hint of their existence, or of the possibility of their existence, not only in the press, but in any form whatever. The subject was not to be alluded to in conversation, it was not to be hinted at, however obscurely, in letters. The very existence of the circular, its subject apart, was to be a dead secret. These measures were successful. A wealthy newspaper proprietor of the North, warmed a little at the end of the Throsters' feast, which was held as usual, it will be remembered, ventured to say to the man next to him, "How awful it would be, wouldn't it, if—" His words were repeated, as proof, one regrets to say, that it was time for old Arnold to pull himself together, and he was fined £1,000. Then, there was the case of an obscure weekly paper published in the county town of an agricultural district in Wales. The Miro's Observer, we will call it, was issued from a stationer's back premises, and filled its 4 pages with accounts of local flower shows, fancy fairs at vicarages, reports of parish councils, and rare bathing fatalities. It also issued a visitors' list, which has been known to contain 6 names. This enlightened organ printed a paragraph, which nobody noticed, which was very like paragraphs that small country newspapers have long been in the habit of printing, which could hardly give so much as a hint to anyone, that is, who was not fully instructed in the secret. As a matter of fact, this piece of intelligence got into the paper because the proprietor, who was also the editor, incautiously left the last processes of this particular issue to the staff, who was the Lord High everything else of the establishment, and the staff put in a bit of gossip he had heard in the market to fill up 2 inches on the back page. But the result was that the Miro's Observer ceased to appear, owing to untoward circumstances, as the proprietor said, and he would say no more. No more, that is, by way of explanation, but a great deal more by way of execration of damned, prying busybodies. Now a censorship that is sufficiently minute and utterly remorseless can do amazing things in the way of hiding, what it wants to hide. Before the war, one would have thought otherwise. One would have said that, censor or no censor, the fact of the murder at X or the fact of the bank robbery at Y would certainly become known, if not through the press, at all events through rumor and the passage of the news from mouth to mouth. And this would be true of England 300 years ago, and of savage tribulans of today. But we have grown of late to such a reverence for the printed word and such a reliance on it, that the old faculty of disseminating news by word of mouth has become atrophied. Forbid the press to mention the fact that Jones has been murdered, and it is marvelous how few people will hear of it, and of those who hear how few will credit the story that they have heard. You meet a man in the train who remarks that he has been told something about a murder in Southwark. There is all the difference in the world between the impression you receive from such a chance communication and that given by half a dozen lines of print with name and street and date and all the facts of the case. People in trains repeat all sorts of tales, many of them false. Newspapers do not print accounts of murders that have not been committed. Then another consideration that has made for secrecy. I may have seemed to say that the old office of rumor no longer exists. I shall be reminded of the strange legend of the Russians and the mythology of the angels of Mons. But let me point out, in the first place, that both these absurdities depended on the papers for their wide dissemination. If there had been no newspapers or magazines, Russians and angels would have made but a brief, vague appearance of the most shadowy kind. A few would have heard of them, fewer still would have believed in them, they would have been gossiped about for a bare week or two, and so they would have vanished away. And, then, again, the very fact of these vain rumors and fantastic tales having been so widely believed for a time was fatal to the credit of any stray mutterings that may have got abroad. People had been taken in twice, they had seen how grave persons, men of credit, had preached and lectured about the shining forms that had saved the British Army at Mons, or had testified to the trains, packed with grey-coated Muscovites, rushing through the land at dead of night, and now there was a hint of something more amazing than either of the discredited legends. But this time there was no word of confirmation to be found in daily paper, or weekly review, or parish magazine, and so the few that heard either laughed, or, being serious, went home and jotted down notes for essays on wartime psychology, collective delusions. I followed neither of these courses. For before the secret circular had been issued, my curiosity had somehow been aroused by certain paragraphs concerning a fatal accident to well-known airmen. The propeller of the airplane had been shattered, apparently by a collision with a flight of pigeons, the blades had been broken and the machine had fallen like lead to the earth. And soon after I had seen this account, I heard of some very odd circumstances relating to an explosion in a great munition factory in the Midlands. I thought I saw the possibility of a connection between two very different events. It has been pointed out to me by friends who have been good enough to read this record, that certain phrases I have used may give the impression that I ascribe all the delays of the war on the Western Front to the extraordinary circumstances which occasioned the issue of the secret circular. Of course this is not the case. There were many reasons for the immobility of our lines from October 1914 to July 1916. These causes have been evident enough and have been openly discussed and deplored. But behind them was something of infinitely greater moment. We lacked men, but men were pouring into the new army. We were short of shells, but when the shortage was proclaimed the nation set itself to mend this matter with all its energy. We could undertake to supply the defects of our army both in men and munitions if the new and incredible danger could be overcome. It has been overcome, rather. Perhaps, it has ceased to exist, and the secret may now be told. I have said my attention was attracted by an account of the death of a well-known airman. I have not the habit of preserving notes, I am sorry to say, so that I cannot be precise as to the date of this event. To the best of my belief it was either towards the end of May or the beginning of June 1915. The newspaper paragraph announcing the death of Flight Lieutenant Western was great enough. Accidents, and fatal accidents, to the men who are storming the air for us are, unfortunately, by no means so rare as to demand an elaborated notice. But the manner in which Weston Reynolds met his death struck me as extraordinary. inasmuch as it refers to danger in the element that we have lately conquered. He was brought down, as I said, by a flight of birds, fishes, as appeared by what was found on the blood-stained and shattered foot of the felon. An eyewitness of the accident, a fellow, Squad Western Reynolds set out from the aerodrome modified that. Hardly any wind. Being old friends, had made the journey to and fro half a dozen times before, and felt perfectly secure and at ease. Wester rose to a great height of noise, and we could scarcely see the machine. I was turning to go when one of the fellows called out, "I say. What's this?" He pointed up, and we saw what looked like a black cloud coming from the south at a tremendous rate. I saw at once it wasn't a cloud, it came with a swirl and a rush quite different from any cloud I've ever seen. But for a second I couldn't make out exactly what it was. It altered its shape and turned into a great crescent, and wheeled and veered about as if it was looking for something. The man who had called out had got his glasses, and was staring for all he was worth. Then he shouted that it was a tremendous flight of birds, thousands of them. They went on wheeling and beating about high up in the air, and we were watching them, thinking it was interesting, but not supposing that they would make any difference to Wester, who was just about out of sight. His machine was just a speck. Then the two arms of the crescent drew in as quick as lightning, and these thousands of birds shot in a solid mass right up there across the sky, and flew away somewhere about nor by west. Then Henley, the man with the glasses, called out, "He's down," and started running, and I went after him. We got a car, and as we were going along Henley told me that he'd seen the machine drop dead, as if it came out of that cloud of birds. He thought then that they must have mucked up the propeller somehow. That turned out to be the case. We found the propeller blades all broken and covered with blood and pigeon feathers, and carcasses of the birds had got wedged in between the blades, and were sticking to them. This was the story that the young airman told one evening in a small company. He did not speak in confidence, so I have no hesitation in reproducing what he said. Naturally, I did not take a verbatim note of his conversation, but I have something of a knack of remembering talk that interests me, and I think my reproduction is very near to the tale that I heard. And let it be noted that the flying man told his story without any sense or indication of a sense that the incredible, or all but the incredible, had happened. So far as he knew, he said, it was the first accident of the kind. Airmen in France had been bothered once or twice by birds he thought they were eagles flying viciously at them, but poor old Wester had been the first man to come up against a flight of some thousands of pigeons. "And perhaps I shall be the next," he added, "but why look for trouble? Anyhow, I'm going to see Tudoloo tomorrow afternoon." Well, I heard the story, as one hears all the varied marvels and terrors of the air, as one heard some years ago of air pockets, strange gulfs or voids in the atmosphere into which airmen fell with great peril, or as one heard of the experience of the airman who flew over the Cumberland Mountains in the burning summer of 1911, and as he swam far above the heights was suddenly and vehemently blown upwards, the hot air from the rocks striking his plane as if it had been a blast from a furnace chimney. We have just begun to navigate a strange region, we must expect to encounter strange adventures, strange perils. And here a new chapter in the chronicles of these perils and adventures had been opened by the death of Western Reynolds, and no doubt invention and contrivance would presently hit on some way of countering the new danger. It was, I think, about a week or 10 days after the airman's death that my business called me to a northern town, the name of which, perhaps, had better remain unknown. My mission was to inquire into certain charges of extravagance which had been laid against the working people, that is, the munition workers of this especial town. It was said that the men who used to earn £2.10 a week were now getting from £7 to £8, that bits of girls were being paid £2 instead of 7 or 8 shillings, and that, in consequence, there was an orgy of foolish extravagance. The girls, I was told, were eating chocolates at 4, 5, and 6 shillings a pound, the women were ordering £30 pianos which they couldn't play, and the men bought gold chains at 10 and 20 guineas apiece. I dived into the town in question and found, as usual, that there was a mixture of truth and exaggeration in the stories that I had heard. Gramophones, for example, they cannot be called in strictness necessaries, but they were undoubtedly finding a ready sale, even in the more expensive brands. And I thought that there were a great many very spick and span perambulators to be seen on the pavement, smart perambulators, painted in tender shades of color and expensively fitted. And how can you be surprised if people will have a bit of a fling, a worker said to me. We're seeing money for the first time in our lives, and it's bright. And we work hard for it, and we risk our lives to get it. You've heard of Explosion yonder. He mentioned certain works on the outskirts of the town. Of course, neither the name of the works nor of the town had been printed. There had been a brief notice of explosion at munition works in the northern district, many fatalities. The working man told me about it, and added some dreadful details. They wouldn't let their folks see bodies, screwed them up in coffins as they found them in shop. The gas had done it. Turned their faces black, you mean? Nay. They were all as if they had been bitten to pieces. This was a strange gas. I asked the man in the northern town all sorts of questions about the extraordinary explosion of which he had spoken to me. But he had very little more to say. As I have noted already, secrets that may not be printed are often deeply kept. Last summer there were very few people outside high official circles who knew anything about the tanks, of which we have all been talking lately, though these strange instruments of war were being exercised and tested in a park not far from London. So the man who told me of the explosion in the munition factory was most likely genuine in his profession that he knew nothing more of the disaster. I found out that he was a smelter employed at a furnace on the other side of the town to the ruined factory. He didn't know even what they had been making there, some very dangerous high explosive, he supposed. His information was really nothing more than a bit of gruesome gossip, which he had heard probably at third or fourth or fifth hand. The horrible detail of faces as if they had been bitten to pieces had made its violent impression on him, that was all. I gave him up and took a tram to the district of the disaster, a sort of industrial suburb, 5 miles from the center of the town. When I asked for the factory, I was told that it was no good my going to it as there was nobody there. But I found it, a raw and hideous shed with a walled yard about it, and a shut gate. I looked for signs of destruction, but there was nothing. The roof was quite undamaged, and again it struck me that this had been a strange accident. There had been an explosion of sufficient violence to kill workpeople in the building, but the building itself showed no wounds or scars. A man came out of the gate and locked it behind him. I began to ask him some sort of question, or rather, I began to open for a question with "a terrible business here, they tell me," or some such phrase of convention. I got no farther. The man asked me if I saw a policeman walking down the street. I said I did, and I was given the choice of getting about my business forthwith or of being instantly given in charge as a spy. "Thast better be gone and quick about it," was, I think, his final advice, and I took it. Well, I had come literally up against a brick wall. Thinking the problem over, I could only suppose that the smelter or his informant had twisted the phrases of the story. The smelter had said the dead men's faces were bitten to pieces. This might be an unconscious perversion of eaten away. That phrase might describe well enough the effect of strong acids, and, for all I knew of the processes of munition making, such acids might be used and might explode with horrible results in some perilous stage of their admixture. It was a day or two later that the accident to the airman, Western Reynolds, came into my mind. For one of those instants which are far shorter than any measure of time there flashed out the possibility of a link between the two disasters. But here was a wild impossibility, and I drove it away. And yet I think that the thought, mad as it seemed, never left me. It was the secret light that at last guided me through a somber grove of enigmas. It was about this time, so far as the date can be fixed, that a whole district, one might say a whole county, was visited by a series of extraordinary and terrible calamities, which were the more terrible inasmuch as they continued for some time to be inscrutable mysteries. It is, indeed, doubtful whether these awful events do not still remain mysteries to many of those concerned, for before the inhabitants of this part of the country had time to join one link of evidence to another the circular was issued, and thenceforth no one knew how to distinguish undoubted fact from wild and extravagant surmise. The district in question is in the far west of Wales. I shall call it, for convenience, Meirion. In it there is one seaside town of some repute with holiday makers for 5 or 6 weeks in the summer, and dotted about the county there are 3 or 4 small old towns that seem drooping in a slow decay, sleepy and grey with age and forgetfulness. They remind me of what I have read of towns in the west of Ireland. Grass grows between the uneven stones of the pavements, the signs above the shop windows decline, half the letters of these signs are missing, here and there a house has been pulled down, or has been allowed to slide into ruin, and wild greenery springs up through the fallen stones, and there is silence in all the streets. And, it is to be noted, these are not places that were once magnificent. The Celts have never had the art of building, and so far as I can see, such towns as Toey and Merthyr Tegveth and Myros must have been always much as they are now, clusters of poorish, meanly built houses, ill-kept and down at heel. And these few towns are thinly scattered over a wild country where north is divided from south by a wilder mountain range. One of these places is 16 miles from any station, the others are doubtfully and deviously connected by single-line railways served by rare trains that pause and stagger and hesitate on their slow journey up mountain passes, or stop for half an hour or more at lonely sheds called stations, situated in the midst of desolate marshes. A few years ago I travelled with an Irishman on one of these queer lines, and he looked to right and saw the bog with its yellow and blue grasses and stagnant pools, and he looked to left and saw a ragged hillside, set with grey stone walls. "I can hardly believe," he said, "that I'm not still in the wilds of Ireland." Here, then, one sees a wild and divided and scattered region, a land of outland hills and secret and hidden valleys. I know white farms on this coast which must be separate by 2 hours of hard, rough walking from any other habitation, which are invisible from any other house. And inland, again, the farms are often ringed about by thick groves of ash, planted by men of old days to shelter their roof trees from rude winds of the mountain and stormy winds of the sea, so that these places, too, are hidden away, to be surmised only by the wood smoke that rises from the green surrounding leaves. A Londoner must see them to believe in them, and even then he can scarcely credit their utter isolation. Such, then in the main is Meirion, and on this land in the early summer of last year terror descended, a terror without shape, such as no man there had ever known. It began with the tale of a little child who wandered out into the lanes to pick flowers one sunny afternoon, and never came back to the cottage on the hill. Chapter 2. Death in the Village. The child who was lost came from a lonely cottage that stands on the slope of a steep hillside called the Alt, or the Height. The land about it is wild and ragged, here the growth of gorse and bracken, here a marshy hollow of reeds and rushes, marking the course of the stream from some hidden well, here thickets of dense and tangled undergrowth, the outposts of the wood. Down through this broken and uneven ground a path leads to the lane at the bottom of the valley, then the land rises again and swells up to the cliffs over the sea, about a quarter of a mile away. The little girl, Gertrude Morgan, asked her mother if she might go down to the lane and pick the purple flowers. These were orchids that grew there, and her mother gave her leave, telling her she must be sure to be back by tea time, as there was apple tart for tea. She never came back. It was supposed that she must have crossed the road and gone to the cliff's edge, possibly in order to pick the sea pinks that were then in full blossom. She must have slipped, they said, and fallen into the sea, 200 feet below. And, it may be said at once, that there was no doubt some truth in this conjecture, though it stopped very far short of the whole truth. The child's body must have been carried out by the tide, for it was never found. The conjecture of a false step or of a fatal slide on the slippery turf that slopes down to the rocks was accepted as being the only explanation possible. People thought the accident a strange one because, as a rule, Country children living by the cliffs and the sea become wary at an early age, and Gertrude Morgan was almost 10 years old. Still, as the neighbors said, that's how it must have happened, and it's a great pity, to be sure. But this would not do when in a week's time a strong young laborer failed to come to his cottage after the day's work. His body was found on the rocks 6 or 7 miles from the cliffs where the child was supposed to have fallen. He was going home by a path that he had used every night of his life for 8 or 9 years, that he used of dark nights in perfect security, knowing every inch of it. The police asked if he drank, but he was a teetotaler, if he were subject to fits, but he wasn't. And he was not murdered for his wealth, since agricultural laborers are not wealthy. It was only possible again to talk of slippery turf and a false step, but people began to be frightened. Then a woman was found with her neck broken at the bottom of a disused quarry near Llanfihangel, in the middle of the county. The false step theory was eliminated here, for the quarry was guarded with a natural hedge of gorse bushes. One would have to struggle and fight through sharp thorns to destruction in such a place as this, and indeed the gorse bushes were broken as if someone had rushed furiously through them, just above the place where the woman's body was found. And this was strange, there was a dead sheep lying beside her in the pit, as if the woman and the sheep together had been chased over the brim of the fjord. But chased by whom, or by what? And then there was a new form of terror. This was in the region of the marshes under the mountain. A man and his son, a lad, 14 or 15, set out early one morning to work and never reached the farm where they were bound. Their way skirted the marsh, but it was broad, firm, and well metalled, and it had been raised about 2 feet above the bog. But when search was made, the same day, and his son were found dead in the marsh, covered with black slime and pond meat. And they lay some 10 yards from the path, which, it would seem, they must have left deliberately. It was useless of course, to look for chips in the flat heaps, for if one threw a big stone into it a few seconds removed all marks of the disappearance. The men who found the dead bodies beaten up the bridges and bayous of the marsh in hope of finding some trace of the murderers, they rode over the rising ground where the black cattle were grazing, urgent altered by the road, but they discovered nothing. Most of all these horrors, perhaps, were they there, a lonely and unfrequented by-road that winds for many miles up by the northern bank. Here, a mile from any other dwelling, stands a cottage on the edge of a dark wood. It was inhabited by a laborer named Williams, his wife, and their 3 children. One hot summer's evening, a man who had been doing a day's gardening at a rectory 3 or 4 miles away, passed the cottage, and stopped for a few minutes to chat with Williams, the laborer, who was pottering about his garden, while the children were playing on the path by the door. The two talked of their neighbors and of the potatoes till Mrs. Williams appeared at the doorway and said supper was ready, and Williams turned to go into the house. This was about 8 o'clock, and in the ordinary course the family would have their supper and be in bed by 9, or by 9:30 at latest. At 10 o'clock that night the local doctor was driving home along the highway. His horse shied violently and then stopped dead just opposite the gate to the cottage. The doctor got down, frightened at what he saw, and there on the roadway lay Williams, his wife, and the 3 children, stone dead, all of them. Their skulls were battered in as if by some heavy iron instrument, their faces were beaten into a pulp. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Theory. It is not easy to make any picture of the horror that lay dark on the hearts of the people of Myrion. It was no longer possible to believe or to pretend to believe that these men and women and children had met their deaths through strange accidents. The little girl and the young laborer might have slipped and fallen over the cliffs, but the woman who lay dead with the dead sheep at the bottom of the quarry, the 2 men who had been lured into the ooze of the marsh, the family who were found murdered on the highway before their own cottage door, in these cases there could be no room for the supposition of accident. It seemed as if it were impossible to frame any conjecture or outline of a conjecture that would account for these hideous and, as it seemed, utterly purposeless crimes. For a time people said that there must be a madman at large, a sort of country variant of Jack the Ripper, some horrible pervert who was possessed by the passion of death, who prowled darkling about that lonely land, hiding in woods and in wild places, always watching and seeking for the victims of his desire. Indeed, Dr. Lewis, who found poor Williams, his wife, and children miserably slaughtered on the highway, was convinced at first that the presence of a concealed madman in the countryside offered the only possible solution to the difficulty. "I felt sure," he said to me afterwards, "that the Williamses had been killed by a homicidal maniac. It was the nature of the poor creature's injuries that convinced me that this was the case." Some years ago, 37 or 38 years ago, as a matter of fact, I had something to do with a case which on the face of it had a strong likeness to the highway murder. At that time I had a practice at Usk, in Monmouthshire. A whole family living in a cottage by the roadside were murdered one evening. It was called, I think, the Langibby murder. The cottage was near the village of that name. The murderer was caught in Newport. He was a Spanish sailor named Garcia, and it appeared that he had killed father, mother, and the 3 children for the sake of the brass works of an old Dutch clock, which were found on him when he was arrested. Garcia had been serving a month's imprisonment in Usk jail for some small theft, and on his release he set out to walk to Newport, 9 or 10 miles away, no doubt to get another ship. He passed the cottage and saw the man working in his garden. Garcia stabbed him with his sailor's knife. The wife rushed out, he stabbed her. Then he went into the cottage and stabbed the 3 children, tried to set the place on fire, and made off with the clockworks. That looked like the deed of a madman, but Garcia wasn't mad. They hanged him. I may say he was merely a man of a very low type, a degenerate who hadn't the slightest value for human life. I am not sure, but I think he came from one of the Spanish islands, where the people are said to be degenerates, very likely from too much interbreeding. But my point is that Garcia stabbed to kill and did kill, with 1 blow in each case. There was no senseless hacking and slashing. Now those poor people on the highway had their heads smashed to pieces by what must have been a storm of blows. Any one of them would have been fatal, but the murderer must have gone on raining blows with his iron hammer on people who were already stone dead. And that sort of thing is the work of a madman, and nothing but a madman. That's how I argued the matter out to myself just after the event. I was utterly wrong, monstrously wrong. But who could have suspected the truth? Thus Dr. Lewis, and I quote him, or the substance of him, as representative of most of the educated opinion of the district at the beginnings of the terror. People seized on this theory largely because it offered at least the comfort of an explanation, and any explanation, even the poorest, is better than an intolerable and terrible mystery. Besides, Dr. Lewis's theory was plausible. It explained the lack of purpose that seemed to characterize the murders. And yet there were difficulties even from the first. It was hardly possible that a strange madman should be able to keep hidden in a countryside where any stranger is instantly noted and noticed. Sooner or later he would be seen as he prowled along the lanes or across the wild places. Indeed, a drunken, cheerful, and altogether harmless tramp was arrested by a farmer and his man in the fact and act of sleeping off beer under a hedge, but the vagrant was able to prove complete and undoubted alibis, and was soon allowed to go on his wandering way. Then another theory, or rather a variant of Dr. Lewis's theory, was started. This was to the effect that the person responsible for the outrages was, indeed, a madman, but a madman only at intervals. It was one of the members of the Porth Club, a certain Mr. Remnant, who was supposed to have originated this more subtle explanation. Mr. Remnant was a middle-aged man, who, having nothing particular to do, read a great many books by way of conquering the hours. He talked to the club doctors, retired colonels, parsons, lawyers about personality, quoted various psychological textbooks in support of his contention that personality was sometimes fluid and unstable, went back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as good evidence of this proposition, and laid stress on Dr. Jekyll's speculation that the human soul, so far from being one and indivisible, might possibly turn out to be a mere polity, a state in which dwelt many strange and incongruous citizens, whose Characters were not merely unknown but altogether unsurmised by that form of consciousness which so rashly assumed that it was not only the President of the Republic but also its sole citizen. The long and the short of it is, Mr. Remnant concluded, that any one of us may be the murderer, though he hasn't the faintest notion of the fact. Take Llewellyn there. Mr. Payne Llewellyn was an elderly lawyer, a rural Tulkinghorn. He was the hereditary solicitor to the Morgans of Pentwyn. This does not sound anything tremendous to the Saxons of London, but the style is far more than noble to the Celts of West Wales. It is immemorial. Teolo Sant was of the collaterals of the first known chief of the race. And Mr. Payne Llewellyn did his best to look like the legal adviser of this ancient house. He was weighty, he was cautious, he was sound, he was secure. I have compared him to Mr. Tulkinghorn of Lincoln's Inn Fields, but Mr. Llewellyn would most certainly never have dreamed of employing his leisure in peering into the cupboards where the family skeletons were hidden. Supposing such cupboards to have existed, Mr. Payne Llewellyn would have risked large out-of-pocket expenses to furnish them with double, triple, impregnable locks. He was a new man, an Advena, certainly, for he was partly of the Conquest, being descended on one side from Sir Payne Turberville, but he meant to stand by the old stock. Take Llewellyn now, said Mr. Remnant. Look here, Llewellyn, can you produce evidence to show where you were on the night those people were murdered on the highway? I thought not. Mr. Llewellyn, an elderly man, as I have said, hesitated before speaking. I thought not, Remnant went on. Now I say that it is perfectly possible that Llewellyn may be dealing death throughout Myrion, although in his present personality he may not have the faintest suspicion that there is another Llewellyn within him, a Llewellyn who follows murder as a fine art. Mr. Payne Llewellyn did not at all relish Mr. Remnant's suggestion that he might well be a secret murderer, ravening for blood, remorseless as a wild beast. He thought the phrase about his following murder as a fine art was both nonsensical and in the worst taste, and his opinion was not changed when Remnant pointed out that it was used by De Quincey in the title of one of his most famous essays. If you had allowed me to speak, he said with some coldness of manner, I would have told you that on Tuesday last, the night on which those unfortunate people were murdered on the highway, I was staying at the Angel Hotel, Cardiff. I had business in Cardiff, and I was detained till Wednesday afternoon. Having given this satisfactory alibi, Mr. Payne Llewellyn left the club, and did not go near it for the rest of the week. Remnant explained to those who stayed in the smoking room that, of course, he had merely used Mr. Llewellyn as a concrete example of his theory, which, he persisted, had the support of a considerable body of evidence. There are several cases of double personality on record, he declared. And I say again that it is quite possible that these murders may have been committed by one of us in his secondary personality. Why, I may be the murderer in my Remnant B state, though Remnant A knows nothing whatever about it, and is perfectly convinced that he could not kill a fowl, much less a whole family. Isn't it so, Lewis? Dr. Lewis said it was so, in theory, but he thought not in fact. Most of the cases of double or multiple personality that have been investigated, he said, have been in connection with the very dubious experiments of hypnotism, or the still more dubious experiments of spiritualism. All that sort of thing, in my opinion, is like tinkering with the works of a clock, amateur tinkering, I mean. You fumble about with the wheels and cogs and bits of mechanism that you don't really know anything about, and then you find your clock going backwards or striking 240 at tea time. And I believe it's just the same thing with these psychical research experiments. The secondary personality is very likely the result of the tinkering and fumbling with a very delicate apparatus that we know nothing about. Mind, I can't say that it's impossible for one of us to be the highway murderer in his B state, as Rev said. But I think it's extremely improbable. Probability is the guide of life, you know, Remnant, said Dr. Lewis, smiling at that gentleman, as if to say that he also had done a little reading in his day. Therefore, and probability is also the guide of life. When you get a very high degree of probability, that is, you are justified in taking it as a certainty, and on the other hand, if a supposition is highly improbable, you are justified in treating it as an impossible one. That is, in 999 cases out of 1,000. How about 1,000 case? Said Remnant. Supposing these extraordinary facts constitute the 1,000th case. The doctor smiles and shrugs his shoulders, being tired of the subject. But for some time, I think respectable members of Fourth Society would look suspiciously at one another wondering. After all, there might be something. However, both Mr. Remnant's somewhat phrasing theory and Dr. Lewis's plausible theory became untenable when two more victims of an awful and mysterious death were offered up in sacrifice, for a man was found dead in the Llanfihangel quarry, where the woman had been discovered. And on the same day a girl of 15 was found broken on the jagged rocks under the cliffs near Porth. Now, it appeared that these two deaths must have occurred at about the same time, within an hour of one another, certainly, and the distance between the quarry and the cliffs by Black Rock is certainly 20 miles. A motor could do it, one man said. But it was pointed out that there was no high road between the two places, indeed, it might be said that there was no road at all between them. There was a network of deep, narrow, and tortuous lanes that wandered into one another at all manner of queer angles for, say, 17 miles, this in the middle, as it were, between Black Rock and the quarry at Llanfihangel. But to get to the high land of the cliffs one had to take a path that went through 2 miles of fields, and the quarry lay a mile away from the nearest by-road in the midst of gorse and bracken and broken land. And, finally, there was no track of motor car or motor bicycle in the lanes which must have been followed to pass from one place to the other. What about an airplane, then, said the man of the motor car theory. Well, there was certainly an aerodrome not far from one of the two places of death, but somehow, nobody believed that the flying corps harbored a homicidal maniac. It seemed clear, therefore, that there must be more than one person concerned in the terror of Myrion. And Dr. Lewis himself abandoned his own theory. As I said to Remnant at the club, he remarked, improbability is the guide of life. I can't believe that there are a pack of madmen or even 2 madmen at large in the country. I give it up. And now a fresh circumstance or set of circumstances became manifest to confound judgment and to awaken new and wild surmises. For at about this time people realized that none of the dreadful events that were happening all about them was so much as mentioned in the press. I have already spoken of the fate of the Myros Observer. This paper was suppressed by the authorities because it had inserted a brief paragraph about some person who had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. I think that paragraph referred to the first death of Llanfihangel quarry. Thenceforth, horror followed on horror, but no word was printed in any of the local journals. The curious went to the newspaper offices. There were 2 left in the county but found nothing save a firm refusal to discuss the matter. And the Cardiff papers were drawn and found blank, and the London press was apparently ignorant of the fact that crimes that had no parallel were terrorizing a whole countryside. Everybody wondered what could have happened, what was happening, and then it was whispered that the coroner would allow no inquiry to be made as to these deaths of darkness. In consequence of instructions received from the Home Office, one coroner was understood to have said, I have to tell the jury that their business will be to hear the medical evidence and to bring in a verdict immediately in accordance with that evidence. I shall disallow all questions. One jury protested. The foreman refused to bring in any verdict at all. Very good, said the coroner. Then I beg to inform you, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen of the jury, that under the Defense of the Realm Act, I have power to supersede your functions, and to enter a verdict according to the evidence which has been laid before the court as if it had been the verdict of you all. The foreman and jury collapsed and accepted what they could not avoid. But the rumors that got abroad of all this, added to the known fact that the terror was ignored in the press, no doubt by official command, increased the panic that was now arising, and gave it a new direction. Clearly, people reasoned, these government restrictions and prohibitions could only refer to the war, to some great danger in connection with the war. And that being so, it followed that the outrages which must be kept so secret were the work of the enemy, that is of concealed German agents. Chapter 4. The Spread of the Terror. It is time, I think, for me to make one point clear. I began this history with certain references to an extraordinary accident to an airman whose machine fell to the ground after collision with a huge flock of pigeons, and then to an explosion in a northern munition factory, an explosion, as I noted, of a very singular kind. Then I deserted the neighborhood of London, and the northern district, and dwelt on a mysterious and terrible series of events which occurred in the summer of 1915 in a Welsh county, which I have named, for convenience, Meirion. Well, let it be understood at once that all this detail that I have given about the occurrences in Meirion does not imply that the county in the far west was alone or especially afflicted by the terror that was over the land. They tell me that in the villages about Dartmoor the stout Devonshire hearts sank as men's hearts used to sink in the time of plague and pestilence. There was horror, too, about the Norfolk Broads, and far up by Perth no one would venture on the path that leads by Scone to the wooded heights above the Tay. And in the industrial districts, I met a man by chance one day in an odd London corner who spoke with horror of what a friend had told him. "Ask no questions, Ned," he says to me, "but I tell yo I was in Bernigan t'other day, and I met a pal who'd seen 300 coffins going out of a works not far from there. And then the ship that hovered outside the mouth of the Thames with all sails set and beat to and fro in the wind, and never answered any hail, and showed no light. The forts shot at her and brought down one of the masts, but she went suddenly about with a change of wind under what sail still stood, and then veered down channel, and drove ashore at last on the sandbanks and pinewoods of Arcachon, and not a man alive on her, but only rattling heaps of bones. That last voyage of the Semiramis would be something horribly worth telling, but I only heard it at a distance as a yarn, and only believed it because it squared with other things that I knew for certain. This, then, is my point. I have written of the terror as it fell on Meirion, simply because I have had opportunities of getting close there to what really happened. Third or fourth or fifth hand in the other places, but round about Porth and Merthyr Tegveth I have spoken with people who have seen the tracks of the terror with their own eyes. Well, I have said that the people of that far western county realized, not only that death was abroad in their quiet lanes and on their peaceful hills, but that for some reason it was to be kept all secret. Newspapers might not print any news of it, the very juries summoned to investigate it were allowed to investigate nothing. And so they concluded that this veil of secrecy must somehow be connected with the war, and from this position it was not a long way to a further inference, that the murderers of innocent men and women and children were either Germans or agents of Germany. It would be just like the Huns, everybody agreed, to think out such a devilish scheme as this, and they always thought out their schemes beforehand. They hoped to seize Paris in a few weeks, but when they were beaten on the Marne they had their trenches on the Aisne ready to fall back on. It had all been prepared years before the war. And so, no doubt, they had devised this terrible plan against England in case they could not beat us in open fight. There were people ready, very likely, all over the country, who were prepared to murder and destroy everywhere as soon as they got the word. In this way the Germans intended to sow terror throughout England and fill our hearts with panic and dismay, hoping so to weaken their enemy at home that he would lose all heart over the war abroad. It was the Zeppelin notion. In another form, they were committing these horrible and mysterious outrages thinking that we should be frightened out of our wits. It all seemed plausible enough. Germany had by this time perpetrated so many horrors and had so excelled in devilish ingenuities that no abomination seemed too abominable to be probable, or too ingeniously wicked to be beyond the tortuous malice of the Hun. But then came the questions as to who the agents of this terrible design were, as to where they lived, as to how they contrived to move unseen from field to field, from lane to lane. All sorts of fantastic attempts were made to answer these questions, but it was felt that they remained unanswered. Some suggested that the murderers landed from submarines, or flew from hiding places on the west coast of Ireland, coming and going by night, but there were seen to be flagrant impossibilities in both these suggestions. Everybody agreed that the evil work was no doubt the work of Germany, but nobody could begin to guess how it was done. Somebody at the club asked Remnant for his theory. "My theory," said that ingenious person, "is that human progress is simply a long march from one inconceivable to another. Look at that airship of ours that came over Porth yesterday. 10 years ago that would have been an inconceivable sight. Take the steam engine, stake printing, take the theory of gravitation, they were all inconceivable till somebody thought of them. So it is, no doubt, with this infernal dodgery that we're talking about. The Huns have found it out, and we haven't, and there you are. We can't conceive how these poor people have been murdered, because the method's inconceivable to us." The club listened with some awe to this high argument. After Remnant had gone, one member said, "Wonderful man, that." "Yes," said Dr. Lewis. He was asked whether he knew something. And his reply really amounted to "No, I don't. But I have never heard it better put." It was, I suppose, at about this time when the people were puzzling their heads as to the secret methods used by the Germans or their agents to accomplish their crimes that a very singular circumstance became known to a few of the Porth people. It related to the murder of the Williams family on the highway in front of their cottage door. I do not know that I have made it plain that the old Roman road called the highway follows the course of a long, steep hill that goes steadily westward till it slants down and droops towards the sea. On either side of the road the ground falls away, here into deep shadowy woods, here to high pastures, now and again into a field of corn, but for the most part into the wild and broken land that is characteristic of our faun. The fields are long and narrow, stretching up the steep hillside. They fall into sudden dips and hollows. A well springs up in the midst of one and a grove of ash and thorn bends over it, shading it, and beneath it the ground is thick with reeds and rushes. And then may come on either side of such a field territories glistening with the deep growth of bracken, and rough with gorse and rugged with thickets of blackthorn, green lichen hanging strangely from the branches. Such are the lands on either side of the highway. Now on the lower slopes of it, beneath the Williamses' cottage, some 3 or 4 fields down the hill, there is a military camp. The place has been used as a camp for many years, and lately the site has been extended and huts have been erected. But a considerable number of the men were under canvas here in the summer of 1915. On the night of the highway murder this camp, as it appeared afterwards, was the scene of the extraordinary panic of the horses. A good many men in the camp were asleep in their tents soon after 9:30, when the last post was sounded. They woke up in panic. There was a thundering sound on the steep hillside above them, and down upon the tents came half a dozen horses, mad with fright, trampling the canvas, trampling the men, bruising dozens of them and killing 2. Everything was in wild confusion, men groaning and screaming in the darkness, struggling with the canvas and the twisted ropes, shouting out, some of them, raw lads enough, that the Germans had landed, others wiping the blood from their eyes, a few, roused suddenly from heavy sleep, hitting out at one another, officers coming up at the double roaring out orders to the sergeants, a party of soldiers who were just returning to camp from the village seized with fright at what they could scarcely see or distinguish, at the wildness of the shouting and cursing and groaning that they could not understand, bolting out of the camp again and racing for their lives back to the village, everything in the maddest confusion of wild disorder. Some of the men had seen the horses galloping down the hill as if terror itself was driving them. They scattered off into the darkness, and somehow or another found their way back in the night to their pasture above the camp. They were grazing there peacefully in the morning, and the only sign of the panic of the night before was the mud they had scattered all over themselves as they pelted through a patch of wet ground. The farmer said they were as quiet a lot as any in Myrion. He could make nothing of it. Indeed, he said, I believe they must have seen the devil himself to be in such a fright as that. Save the people. Now all this was kept as quiet as might be at the time when it happened. It became known to the men of the Porth Club in the days when they were discussing the difficult question of the German outrages, as the murders were commonly called. And this wild stampede of the farm horses was held by some to be evidence of the extraordinary and unheard of character of the dreadful agency that was at work. One of the members of the club had been told by an officer who was in the camp at the time of the panic that the horses that came charging down were in a perfect fury of fright, that he had never seen horses in such a state, and so there was endless speculation as to the nature of the sight or the sound that had driven half a dozen quiet beasts into raging madness. Then, in the middle of this talk, 2 or 3 other incidents, quite as odd and incomprehensible, came to be known, borne on chance trickles of gossip that came into the towns from outland farms, or were carried by cottagers tramping into Porth on market day with a fowl or 2 and eggs and garden stuff, scraps and fragments of talk gathered by servants from the country folk and repeated to their mistresses. And in such ways it came out that up at Plas Newydd there had been a terrible business over swarming the bees, they had turned as wild as wasps and much more savage. They had come about the people who were taking the swarms like a cloud. They settled on one man's face so that you could not see the flesh for the bees crawling all over it, and they had stung him so badly that the doctor did not know whether he would get over it, and they had chased a girl who had come out to see the swarming, and settled on her and stung her to death. Then they had gone off to a break below the farm and got into a hollow tree there, and it was not safe to go near it, for they would come out at you by day or by night. And much the same thing had happened, it seemed, at 3 or 4 farms and cottages where bees were kept. And there were stories, hardly so clear or so credible, of sheepdogs, mild and trusted beasts, turning as savage as wolves and injuring the farm boys in a horrible manner. In one case it was said with fatal results. It was certainly true that old Mrs. Owen's favourite Brahma Dorking cock had gone mad. She came into Porth one Saturday morning with her face and her neck all bound up and plastered. She had gone out to her bit of a field to feed the poultry the night before, and the bird had flown at her and attacked her most savagely, inflicting some very nasty wounds before she could beat it off. There was a stake handy, lucky for me, she said, and I did beat him till the life was out of him. But what is come to the world, whatever? Now a remnant, the man of theories, was also a man of extreme leisure. It was understood that he had succeeded to ample means when he was quite a young man, and after tasting the sabres of the law, as it were, for half a dozen terms at the board of the Middle Temple, he had decided that it would be senseless to bother himself with passing examinations for a profession which he had not the faintest intention of practicing. So he turned a deaf ear to all the danger ringing through the temple courts, and set himself out to potter amiably through the world. He had pottered all over Europe, he had looked at Africa, and had even put his head in at the door of the East, on a trip which included the Greek Isles and Boston. Getting into the middle 50s, he had settled at Porth for the sake, as he said, of the Gulf Stream and the fuchsia hedges, and pottered over his books and his theories and the local gossip. He was no more brutal than the general public, which witnessed tales of mysterious crime, but it must be said that the terror, black that it was a boon to him. Here he investigated and poked about with the relish of a man whose life amuses him that. He listened attentively to the strange tales of bees and dogs, poultry that ate, country baskets of butter, rabbits, and green peas, and he evolved at last a most extraordinary theory. This discovery, as he thought it, that one night must stop this and take his view of the matter. I want to talk to you, said Rembrandt to the doctor, about what I have called provisionally, the Z-ray. To be continued.